Hello everyone. Today we'll be covering Chapter 1, where we'll be defining communication generally and interpersonal communication more specifically. I'm going to give you just a general overview of some of the key ideas and concepts and go into a little more depth of some of the things that aren't necessarily covered in the textbook, but I think are really important. So before we get into defining interpersonal communication, I think it's important to define communication and to talk about why it's important to communicate. So when we talk about communication generally, what I'm talking about is communication that is symbolic, so it stands for something. It's interpretive, meaning that people have to attach meaning to it. It's transactional, which means that there are more than two people involved and there's feedback going on. It's contextual, occurring in a certain place or location, and it involves people creating shared meaning. So it's very purposeful in its intention. In terms of the communication process, your book talks about the transactional model of communication, and there are three different models, but for the purpose of this course, we're going to talk about the transactional model. In this model of communication, we have a number of different elements at work. So in terms of who's involved, we have both a sender and a receiver. We also then have the roles that each of these people are engaging in. So the sender is engaged in communicating through a channel, and they are sending a message through that channel. They are encoding the message, the sender, meaning they are packaging the communication, and then they are sending it off to the receiver, where the receiver is decoding or understanding the message, interpreting the message. And all of this is impacted by noise, and we're going to go over noise a little bit more in a few minutes. And in this process, it's called transactional because what's occurring at the same time is feedback. And if feedback isn't occurring at the same time, then we're engaged in a very different type of communication. So why study interpersonal communication? Well, there's two important things. So two things you want to think about are the personal and social issue related to this. And so this goes to the idea of, can you use communication in a way to create, maintain, and dissolve relationships in an appropriate and an effective way? You're going to hear those terms over and over and over in this course because, as I mentioned in my intro video, I think communication competence is one of the most important things one can learn in this course. The second reason why it's important to study interpersonal communication is the professional aspect of this. So you'll want to be able to effectively communicate with people in a job interview, with your colleagues, a whole bunch of different reasons, knowing how to communicate effectively in your teams. So hopefully this course will give you some of those skills to be able to do that a little more effectively. Your book then gives you the elements of interpersonal communication. So you're going to see the diagram that looks very close to the diagram that I put in the PowerPoint slide about transactional communication. So again, we have the sender, the receiver, there's noise going on, there's a channel, feedback, and again, there's continual communication that goes back and forth in a certain context. So I'd like you to look a little bit more in your chapter about all of those different elements. So the source, the receiver, the message. When talking about the message, you want to take into consideration the different types of messages. So, for example, upward communication. What role does power play in that type of communication? Who can and can't communicate in that particular type of communication situation? What about meta messages? Messages contained within other messages. Feedback and feed-forward messages. Feed-forward's interesting. You can think about that as maybe your caller ID that appears on your phone. So this is the preview of the message. So even before you talk to the person, you already are preparing yourself because you are getting a sense of who is calling you, and that's going to then frame and shape the way that you talk to that person as opposed to someone else who might be calling you. And then think about the channel, the way that you are sending the message. And then your noise and your context. So one important thing to consider in interpersonal communication, your book elaborates a little bit more, are the principles of interpersonal communication. So I'm not going to go through all of these right now. I'd like you to read a little bit more about them, but just know that interpersonal communication is intentional. It does a number of different things. It involves power. It can be ambiguous. It's inevitable, right? You are forced to communicate with other people on a daily basis, so why not do it in an appropriate and an effective way? The nature of interpersonal communication also involves interdependent people, so people who are connected in some sort of way. It's relational, so within this space that's communication is occurring, we're also creating certain types of relationships, right? Because we're dependent on, like I said before, the other people. It exists on a continuum, and I'll show you that. You'll see that chart in your PowerPoint a little bit more. Next week, we're going to talk about it involves verbal and nonverbal messages. So not only is it what you say, but it's how you say it. It exists in varied forms. It's transactional, and it involves choice. So as you move through the PowerPoint, I hope you watched the video about why we communicate. There are 4 particular reasons or needs why we communicate. And I use the example of the 2 babies. So I asked you the question in the PowerPoint, what example of the needs are fulfilled in this particular video? So as you're looking through this and watching the video, you should think of 2 things specifically. So for the babies, identity needs are being utilized. So they're communicating with one another to understand who they are in relation to the other. Funny enough, I have twins myself, so I can really relate to this little video. My boys are 7 months old, and they are starting to communicate with one another in a way that's very intentional and unique to themselves. And so by doing that, they're creating this certain twin identity that's different than any other relationship they're going to have. So it fulfills that particular identity need. They're going to come to understand themselves, who they are in relation to one another, brothers and twins. The other need that's being fulfilled in this video are social needs. So they are connecting with one another. They are fulfilling this need to understand that they are part of something larger in the world and that they are in a certain relationship. And that relationship then is going to impact their physical needs. So the 2 main needs identified again in this video are identity needs and social needs. Now to the definition of interpersonal communication. I like to look at it in 2 different ways. So there's what's called a quantitative definition and a qualitative definition. If you've heard of these 2 words before, you'll know that one deals with numbers and one deals with understanding. So quantitative deals with numbers. So for interpersonal communication, a quantitative definition would say that interpersonal communication involves 2 people communicating. Pretty simple. Qualitative goes a little bit deeper and talks about what's occurring. So one of the definitions I like to use is from McCormick, and he says that interpersonal communication is a dynamic form of communication between 2 or more people in which the message exchange significantly influence the thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and relationships of the other. So here you see that we're combining both the quantitative idea, there are 2 or more people, but also understanding what's happening in that interaction. Thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and relationships are being impacted by what's said and oftentimes what's not said. So interpersonal communication is indeed a process. So to be competent, you need to be mindful. Your book talks about 4 different ways to be a competent communicator. So thinking about, as I mentioned before, the key ideas of being appropriate and effective. So the first main idea that would fall under this that your book discusses is being critical and mindful. So being unbiased and clear in your communication and your relationships. Can you be skillful? Going to the appropriate and effective. Do you have the tools in order to talk to people in a way that's going to have a positive impact? That's not to say that all communication is positive. Think about conflict. A lot of people like to avoid conflict, but conflict is very essential in growth in terms of relationships. And we're going to talk more about that at the end of the semester, but keep in mind that dealing with conflict and acknowledging when conflicts exist is extremely important. And it's a skill. Third, you want to be culturally aware and sensitive. So thinking about how attitudes and values of other people might influence the way that they behave and talk. And finally, being ethical. So what does this mean? Can you break it down more than just being right and wrong in terms of your behaviors. In terms of communication, think about lying. What do you think about lying in relationships? Can it be positive? Can it be negative? So the takeaway from this chapter, please look over the class objectives, but what we're trying to do is to think about being more competent in our communication. Can you define communication? Can you define interpersonal communication? The principles involved?